It's all about flexing muscles. It's about building that capacity to understand even where that is not leading to a story. So think about reading financial statements as your workout. And it's going to pay off sometime when you really have to make a heavy lift, to stretch the metaphor too far.
This is Margot Gibbs. She is a senior reporter at Lighthouse Reports, specialized in money trails.
I don't know other organizations outside Lighthouse that actually call it money trails.
Okay, so money trails, or as we actually learned, what other people call financial investigations.
Yes, exactly. Margot's work involves digging into the money flows which act as an engine behind a lot of our broken systems. And that's what she will be talking to us about today. How to become a money trails expert, which by the end of this episode, you'll learn is a bit like going to the gym. It might sound weird, but she's here to tell you that like any good skill, it's just a muscle that you can learn to flex, and anyone can be an expert like Margot.
Yeah, so consider this episode your money trails workout of the day.
Exactly. And so for a bit more context, she is the person that we turn to at Lighthouse for all our money trails queries. And I think I'll keep saying money trails now because it's too ingrained in my brain. So Margot's an incredible and seasoned financial investigator. She got her start at Greenpeace doing financial research. And since then, her work has exposed how financial speculators drove the food price crisis after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how the world's biggest meat companies got rich on the back of subsidies whilst avoiding taxation.
Yeah, and actually one of Margot's latest investigations called Poison PR, which longtime listeners might recognize because we actually spoke to Elena on the episode about how to get information from sources. If you haven't listened to that episode, be sure to check it out. That investigation uncovered a US taxpayer-funded network that ran a covert campaign to downplay the risks of harmful pesticides and discredit environmentalists in Africa, Europe, and the US. It's actually just been nominated for a One World Media Award, so great job to the team. Okay, let's get into it.
From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight, a monthly deep dive into the world of collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, Impact Editor Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
And it can actually kind of give the slightly misleading impression that you're going to be able to trace every trail of money from a bank account to a company. Where that is correct is that money drives almost everything that we will be investigating at an organization like Lighthouse.
So the first thing that we asked Margot was, what does she think money trails actually is?
But money trails is inspiring because it does suggest a route. And there is a route that money takes. And it's not like you're ever going to be able to see the total map, but you are going to be able to see different little intersection points where you can get a view on what money there is in the system that you're particularly interested in.
So I guess what Margot is saying here is that money trails reporting digs into the financial powerhouse, which is very often the fuel for wrongdoing. It can include things like investigating tax abuse, corruption, and financial crime, or even just finding out who benefits financially from activities which harm people or harm the environment.
And I think we should start off by saying people might find the idea of money trails reporting as something intimidating or boring. When you think about financial investigations, you might imagine going through endless pages of company documents, but that's not all there is to it.
I mean, there are some elements of rifling through company documents, but hopefully we can even make that fun. Big promise, I know.
And our guests today will be sharing some creative ways they go about doing their work to unlock key pieces of evidence. And speaking of guests, we will also be talking to Giacomo Zandonini. He is an independent investigative reporter who has been covering borders, tech, and migration. His work often involves tracking down EU funding, a notoriously hard task. And he will tell us all about that later in the episode. Okay, so we asked Margot, What do you need to do to get financial documents?
Whilst lots of that private banking information isn't going to be available, there are multiple places in the world where that information is available. That could be a public register, it could be trade databases, it could be private companies who are developing data in a particular area because it's going to make them money. And you can think creatively about how you can get access to that information as a journalist. So it's trying to uncover the force. What's the metaphor here? It's not the engine, but it's the routes through which the fuel of whichever destructive industry you're looking at, like what the routes for powering that are. You don't have to be particularly numerate.
I was so relieved when Margot said this, because even the term money trails or financial investigations or whatever we want to call it feels quite intimidating to me. But from our conversation with Margot, she dispelled some of these myths that you need kind of like a maths genius brain to figure this stuff out.
You don't have to be amazing at maths to do money trails investigations. It helps to see things in terms of patterns. You tend to be looking for unusual things. If you're looking at, say, like company statements, you're looking for things that look unusual. One of my favorite investigations for the last couple of years was in the Hunger Profiteers investigation in the Food Systems newsroom, where we showed how hedge funds using a particular trading method had made $1.9 billion betting on food in the months around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we did that by recreating an industry model that was run by a bank, Société Générale. I'm not going to say it in the French form because I'll sound silly. But we did that basically by public data that they had on like how much these kinds of funds made, and using a small amount of information that this bank, Société Générale, were provided with like each year about how much money was in those kinds of funds.
For context, this investigation Margot mentions came out back in 2023. It basically revealed how financial speculators profited from the food price crisis after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the evidence from that investigation went on to be shared with members of parliament across Europe, and it resulted in actual change of policy, which now allows for excessive speculation to be stopped.
We knew that speculation was a really big issue around the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it was quite difficult to pin down exactly who was making what, because a lot of the data was kind of on a national statistical level rather than being able to drill down into the actual people who benefited. And there was this lovely moment around that where I saw that there was this index that was kept by a bank called Société Générale, which showed in principle how much hedge funds that followed a particular trading strategy would be making from their betting on food prices. I was like, okay, so if they show in principle how much return you make from this much investment, surely if we find out how much money is flowing into those funds, we can find out how much they profited. And in this case, it was lovely and clean because there are 10 companies that they follow every year, and they essentially get access to how much money goes into each of those 10 funds. And that's information that they have and that they were happy to give us. So there was this like linking moment. We were like, oh, I don't have to search around every company account to find out how much money they're making. Someone is doing that for me. It was a press call to them. It was just a phone call with the people who kept that data to find out how much money was going into that system each year that allowed us to come up with that quite shocking figure of how much these hedge funds were making from betting on food prices around Ukraine. And of course, these companies have an interest in sharing that data with people like Société Générale because they want more money in their funds. And if they can show that they've got good performance, then that's good because they'll get more investment and they'll make more money themselves.
Margot makes it sound easy. It was an incredibly complex investigation, but the fact that she says that one of her big aha moments was just calling this press officer is so telling of how much Money Trail's work is really about finding the right people to connect to.
Yeah, one of the things that really stuck with me from our chat with Margot was just how much of her work is simply scoping out people who might have interests that align with the purpose of your investigation. So people who might want to share certain types of information. So I guess then step one of any investigation you might be doing is to just figure out who might have that access to that information that you might need, and doing the very scary thing and picking up the phone and calling them. Margot had some creative suggestions about that.
Another tip I think that's important to think about is whatever area you are interested in, think about what private data is being compiled by like small startup companies who might have an interest in sharing it with you. If given that a lot of information is in principle public, a lot of people are also like compiling that into useful forms of data that can be helpful to us as journalists. And this is like a really key don't ask, don't get area. Lots of that information is siloed away, and it's just through talking to people that we get access to it. Now, there are some kind of obvious big companies here like Refinitiv or LSEG and Bloomberg. There are also like trade databases like Panjiva and OEC, but you'll find more particular ones in the different areas you're looking at. And there are also lots of institutions, whether like they're academic institutions or campaigning organizations, who also might have access to these databases. So if it's one where they're not going to just give you free access as a reporter, someone else might have one of those expensive logins and have a shared interest in giving you access to that data.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a quick note here to briefly explain what trade databases are, because I was a little confused. These are places that store information about the movement of goods across borders. They can give information on a country level, like what's the value of avocados that the US imported from Mexico last year? Or on a company level, like who is buying beef from a Brazilian beef company? And speaking of sharing logins, for those who want to get started on this kind of reporting, Margot shared some of her tools that helped her at the beginning of her career.
I mean, in terms of good introductions to, like, say, these basic building blocks of understanding how companies work, for example, there is a lovely introduction to company accounts written by a forensic accountant called Raj Bairolia, published by the Centre for Investigative Journalism in the UK. And it gives you the fundamentals of how to read an annual financial statement. I still have this by my desk. I probably started using it 15 years ago. It's incredibly helpful in like demystifying a lot of the financial terms. So if you open a set of financial accounts of like a company that you're interested in, it's going to help you navigate those financial statements. That's like a kind of those nice basic literacy points. It gives you a roadmap to understanding things. In terms of why to do it is what we were just discussing. Like the money is what is powering almost every interest in that we are investigating. So understanding how that works is crucial to understanding the story properly. Another reason to do it is a lot of this information is public. So when I started out, to read the financial statements of a private company would cost you £3 in the UK. And while that's not a huge amount for one company 1 year, it builds up over time. What's amazing in recent years is the amount of data that has become public. So all of that information in the UK is now free, and that's true for a number of other countries. And it puts a whole lot of valuable data in your hands.
One of the key takeaways that I think will be helpful for other reporters is to think about how much information is often already in the public realm. Margot explained how in Europe, for instance, a lot of information about multinational companies is already made public. Even if, let's say, you are reporting on a multinational company's operations in Kenya, if that company has connections to Europe, there are many European jurisdictions where you can get financial statements. And equally, there are many other countries where financial information is made public. So it's always worth being on the lookout for that. And actually, in the book that Margot recommended, there is a bunch of information about what kind of data you can get in each country across the world. So that's super valuable. So it's a lot about thinking about who else has an interest in keeping this kind of information that you're looking for. Is it the banking analysts who cover a particular company for people who are investing in it? There are people who work as researchers for banks whose job is to keep tabs on companies. They might sometimes have a shared interest with you, and a lot of their names are listed on company websites. And so I think Margot put it in a really compelling way.
People love being experts is another tip. Like flattering people into explaining how things work is a great way of coming to understand how things work.
We're taking a quick break now, but when we come back, we'll be talking with Giacomo Zandonini, a journalist who has spent much of his career tracking EU money.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the world of investigative journalism. If you want to hear more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have a suggestion about a topic we can talk about or a person we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com. And we're back. Backlight is a monthly deep dive bringing you inside the world of investigative journalism. This week, we're chatting to two very seasoned money trails experts. They're bringing you some tips, tools, and learnings from their experiences following the scent of dirty money around the world.
I'm Giacomo Zandonini. I'm an investigative reporter. I'm based in Rome, in Italy, and I've been covering the impact of European migration and border policies for the past decade, at least, or even more than that. And in the context of this investigation with Lighthouse Reports, I was part of a team looking at Turkey's migrant deportation system and European responsibilities in building this system.
So, like Margot, Giacomo has a long track record of doing financial investigations. He has been reporting on European borders for years, and he's published several groundbreaking investigations, which anyone interested should definitely check out. We're going to be linking his profile in the show notes.
And we spoke to Giacomo in the context of his work trying to track down EU public money that's going into basically heightened security at borders, which is actually really notoriously hard to do. Margot talked a little bit about kind of corporate records of private companies and how whether or not they're readily available in Europe. This does actually not apply to public funding in Europe. In fact, the flows of money that fund a lot of EU border programs are notoriously opaque, even though this is actually public taxpayer money that's going into it. But in an investigation that we worked with Giacomo on, he found a way around it.
Exactly. He was one of over 20 reporters working on Lighthouse's Turkey EU-funded deportation machine investigation. This story revealed how the European Union was funding the mass detention and deportation of Syrians and Afghans in violation of their rights, with a lot of people having been subject to torture and abuse in this process. A crucial part of this reporting was unveiling exactly in what ways the EU was funneling these hundreds of millions of euros of taxpayer money to detention centers that tortured and abused people.
Yeah, and actually the way we tracked down how and where this money was being spent was really crucial to the rights groups and the policymakers who had kind of been aware of these centers but couldn't directly tie it to EU public money. And in response from our investigation, the EU Commission got grilled about the findings during a press conference. It also triggered an open letter to the EU Commission from 20 human rights groups. And finally, it helped politicians from the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, otherwise known as the LIBE Committee, and also the EU Ombudsman to pressure the Commission to respond to the findings.
And the European Commission particularly was keen in trying to prevent us from access to certain information. It was also difficult for us to have a complete list of the projects that have been funded with EU money in the past decade. We had contradicting information depending on different press requests we initiated. And so it was a pretty long exercise of cross-checking information we received from different sources to build a database, which was then used for the investigation.
So the team built the most comprehensive database to date on how European money was being funneled into this deportation system in Turkey.
So the question was, to what extent the EU, the European Commission and member states are aware of abuses happening inside Turkish removal centers that were built, set up, refurbished with European Union money. And also, while trying to have a reply to this question, we found several different obstacles. Basically, our freedom of information requests to access documents by the European Union were routinely disregarded, were routinely dismissed. And even when we complained to the European Ombudsman, the institution targeted also with monitoring the behavior of other European institutions, the correct behavior, then we were not able to access internal reports, which include also information on the fundamental rights impact of these policies.
And just popping in again with another little note for those who might be unclear on what freedom of information requests are. Basically, these are formal requests for non-public information that any journalist can make to a public body, like a government agency. So you might ask for things like internal documents, emails, and meeting minutes.
It was a pretty long work and intense one. The project overall lasted for about 6 months, and the money trail part since the beginning was an integral and key part of the research. We started from material originating from this program, internal reports, progress reports, annual reports by the European Commission, where we could identify bits of information on specific projects. We match this information with other sources like public procurement pages at the European Union level, but also in Turkey, particularly information on different platforms and websites by the Turkish Ministry of Interior. Then we asked for information directly, of course, to the European Commission through a set of press requests. Then also we reach out to different civil society organizations that are working or researchers that are working on monitoring these programs and this type of cooperation on migration. We had a final database tracking down about 213 million euros dedicated specifically to building or reinforcing or refurbishing detention facilities in Turkey. We mapped about 1 billion euros of funding going to detention and deportation policies.
Yeah, it was massive, 1 billion euros. And this was after tracking down and going through thousands of pages of documents, so many calls with sources, internal reports, freedom of information requests, and basically cross-referencing all of that information. So it's not just one piece of evidence that's kind of the smoking gun, if you will. There's it's like attempting a 1,000-piece puzzle, but with no reference picture of what the puzzle is at the start.
And basically, this was everything from looking at equipment at the centers, buses that were moving people between detention centers, and databases that were also being used to record data from asylum seekers.
What Giacomo describes is quite similar to actually what Margot mentioned earlier, reaching out to all sorts of different sources, from people at civil society organizations to diplomatic sources, and try to map out and piece together how this funding was being used.
He had a few tips for journalists who would like to do similar work on tracking EU funds, but a word of warning, a lot of patience and time is needed. And just like Margot told us, it's often about finding creative ways to solve problems.
My first tip is consider that you'll need a lot of time. And my second tip is you need preferably to coordinate, to have teamwork. It's very useful. And to be able also to cross-check your information with others who've been working on a similar topic. It's crucial to be able to interact with the researchers who've been maybe dedicating years to the topic, while for us, for journalists, usually we need to concentrate in a shorter period. And then, of course, another tip is to use FOI requests and to start at a very early stage of your investigation to use them and to strategize around how you will use FOI requests. It's getting more and more difficult in the past years to obtain relevant documents, but still there's a way to do. Fourth tip I would give is also contact people who are interested on these topics in policymaking. For example, parliament members of the European Parliament or the national parliament that can access information through internal channels, in some cases at least, in a quicker way than we can do as journalists. They could be interested in what we found, the main results of our investigations.
Giacomo also talked to us about how he hopes more journalists start digging into this type of work. He pointed out that considering a money trails angle in an investigation is often a great way to engage a wider audience. So in the case of this investigation, there may be a section of the public who is not so worried about EU's role in these rights abuses, but they might be concerned about how this public funding is being used or misused.
It's often very hard to reach people who have a very different mindset, but I think it's part of what we need to do, and money trail contributes to this for a purpose of, let's say, correctly using European funding or public funding in general. So I think that's one of the reasons why I would suggest everybody to keep working on money trail and coordinate. I think it's important to have a community of journalists that share expertise, tips, tools to improve the money trail side of investigation, and by doing so, improving the quality of what we do and accountability and oversight and scrutiny over institutions.
Yeah, it's been a lot of information to unpack, quite a lot of tips from both of our guests to digest. But I think the bottom line here is that a lot of this work is actually thinking innovatively with a good eye for detail. And the best news is you definitely don't need to be an expert at maths.
And to bring it full circle, it's also about practicing what Margot calls the muscle of becoming literate in some of these documents, whether it be financial statements and corporate accounts. And you can do this just by doing a quick Google search to find out what is available from the companies you're looking into. There might be some financial lingo to get used to, but a lot of the sources that Margot mentioned are a good way to understand the money trails world.
Yeah, and I think it's really easy to get lost in the small details of this work. But what I like about kind of money trails and the way both Margot and Giacomo explained how they work is that it's actually really about understanding how certain systems are perpetuated and enabled by who is funding them. So it's really, really vital for identifying both who benefits from kind of crime and corruption, but also how public money is being spent. Basically, that's just to say that this whole conversation really expanded my understanding of exactly what money trails is and what Margot does on a day-to-day basis. So that's all we have for you now this week. Thank you so much for listening. To keep updated, as always, with our investigations, you can follow us on all of our social medias, on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky. You can find us there at LH Reports, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. All of those will be linked in the show notes.
This episode was produced and hosted by Tessa Pang and Beatriz Ramalho Silva. It was sound edited and designed by Spuvio. And leave us a rating or send this episode to a friend. It really helps.
Thanks for listening, everyone.